Well, good morning, everyone. Before I dive in, I want to give a little shout out to our worship team. They got sideswiped by sickness this morning, and so we were supposed to have roughly twice the number of people leading worship this morning. And I don't know if you know this, but it's really difficult to be flexible and to roll with the punches and to change things up and also hear from the Holy Spirit at the same time. And this morning's worship was so sweet and so good and so powerful, and I'm sure a lot of you would have never known. And so I just wanted to publicly thank them, publicly honor them, and if you see them, to thank them as well. If you are new, my name is Sharon. I am one of the pastors here. And this morning, I wanted to begin by sharing kind of a fun fact about my 3 children. So if you ask any of my 3 children, really any of them, who is our family related to that is famous? Like, what's the one famous person that our family is related to? All 3 of them will give you this exact same answer without hesitation. They will tell you we are related to Abraham Lincoln. Now, that is incorrect. We are not related to Abraham Lincoln. Who we are related to is Abraham Lincoln's wife, Mary Todd. On Ike's side of the family, we are very, very, very distantly related to Mary Todd. And it doesn't matter how many times we have explained to our kids, we're not actually related to Abraham Lincoln, not by blood at all. We're distantly related to his wife. It doesn't matter. This does not stop them, slow them down from telling their teachers, telling their classmates, telling their camp counselors that our family is related to Abraham Lincoln. And so because they are so proud of this fake news about our family, we talk about Abraham Lincoln quite often in our home. And all that to say, because we talk about him a lot, I know a lot about him, I was really surprised this week to learn something about him that I had never heard before, which is that Abraham Lincoln, throughout his presidency, he actually spent a lot of time living somewhere else other than the White House. During the summer and part of early fall, he would actually leave the White House and go stay in a cottage. But what was so fascinating to me about this is that the cottage wasn't in the mountains, it wasn't at the beach, it wasn't at like Martha's Vineyard. I think that's where all the presidents go. It wasn't there. It was just a few miles away from the White House. It's about a 20-minute drive today. I don't know how long that would have taken on horseback, but it was basically in the same area as the White House. And I thought this was so weird. Like, why is he leaving the White House to just stay pretty close by? But the reason why he did this is that this cottage afforded him time and space to think. He would go there and he would reportedly just sit in his chair by the window, staring into the sky for hours and hours on end, just alone with his thoughts. He would go on these long walks. And this was really important work for him to do and really important space for him to have, because at the White House, he's constantly entertaining visitors. He's constantly having meetings, constantly having to make choices and big decisions, and there's just lots of noise. And so he needed this place of solitude where he could really process some of these truly weighty things. And so it was at this cottage that he actually wrote many of the early drafts of the Gettysburg Address, as well as the Emancipation Proclamation. And so this practice of withdrawing, of seeking solitude, was actually really formative for his leadership. And because of this, a number of biographers have noted how important this practice was. In his book, Digital Minimalism, Cal Newport writes, Lincoln's time alone with his thoughts played a crucial role in his ability to navigate a demanding wartime presidency. We can therefore say with only mild hyperbole that in a certain sense, solitude helped save the nation. Now, this morning we are kicking off a practice that our whole church participates in twice a year, which is to deep dive a spiritual discipline. And if you are new and don't know why we do this, or you've been around for a while and you would simply like a refresher, there is a very specific reason why we devote twice a year to the whole church studying a spiritual discipline, which is the truth that what forms you is not your beliefs, but your habits. Now, this is a truth that we don't always intuit when it comes to faith. We very often think that what I know about God, what I know about Jesus, that this is what grows my faith. That's kind of the operating assumption. But we know this truth more intuitively in other areas of our lives. Maybe you're training for a race or you're wanting to get healthy, to lose weight. It doesn't matter how all the knowledge that you have about how you should eat healthy. It doesn't matter all the knowledge that you have about how and what sort of exercises you should do. None of that makes any difference whatsoever for your body unless you actually do them every day. And the spiritual life is like that. What cultivates our faith is not actually knowledge about Jesus, but our daily habits. And the spiritual disciplines are those habits, those tools that help us to grow our faith in Christ. And so twice a year, we want to equip you with those tools. Now, that said, I want to be really, really clear that there is nothing magical about the spiritual disciplines. These are not foolproof formulas for growing your faith. They lack any power to transform your life whatsoever without the Holy Spirit. And so whenever we practice them, what we are doing is not some activity independent of God, but we are partnering with God in our own growth. So that is why twice a year we study one of these disciplines. And if you're new, what this looks like, practically speaking, is we don't just teach about it on Sunday morning, but our small groups also study this every week. We have a series of teaching videos that we go through, led by John Mark Comer. A lot of groups watch those videos. And so if you are not in a small group, but you would like to follow along throughout the week, you would like to go deeper, I'm going to put up a QR code right here. You can scan that QR code, and that will take you to a site where you can access these videos and you can follow along. But all that to say, with that long introduction, the spiritual discipline that we are going to spend the next 4 weeks studying is that of solitude. Now, for some of you, this is the best news that you have heard all week because you have small children and you are literally never alone. And so I have just given you permission to go home and tell your spouse that you need some alone time because the pastor said so. For others of you, this is not necessarily good news. Maybe you are someone that is alone a lot, or you feel alone a lot, or you are just like me and solitude sounds terrible generally. That's actually a key difference between me and my husband is how our natural affinity, I would say, to the practice of solitude. This difference in reaction is contained in our marriage. Just to give you an example, 2 summers ago, I was on sabbatical, and so I went away on a spiritual retreat where I was alone a lot. And the only time I was with other people was during meals. And so I never missed a meal. And I always sat at the table with the most people. And it was typically other pastors who were on sabbatical. And so I asked all of them to tell me their entire life story because I was just craving this human connection. Now, contrast that with this past summer when my husband Ike was on sabbatical and he went away to a monastery during his sabbatical. And when you get there, they actually give you the opportunity to participate in a silent retreat where no one is speaking to you, you're not speaking to anyone. But if you want to do a silent retreat, they give you a lanyard to wear, and this just indicates that if someone's walking past you, just not to speak to you. Well, Ike did not want to do a silent retreat because he still wanted to call home, he wanted to talk to me, he wanted to talk to the kids, but he still took the lanyard because he did not want anyone talking to him there. All of that to say, different people will have different reactions to this practice. And one of the things we have seen with every single one of the spiritual disciplines that we have done is that people have very different reactions to them. And for that reason, it's important to begin this whole study by explaining where it comes from in the first place. And this discipline, like all the other spiritual disciplines that we have studied, comes directly from the life of Jesus. And so this morning, what I'm going to do is offer you a brief introduction to the practice of solitude, beginning with how Jesus practiced it himself. And this will ground the whole series in what solitude is and what it is for. And I also just want to add, for any of you who think the idea of spending 4 weeks studying solitude sounds like actual torture and you're thinking about being out on this, I want you to know, first of all, I am with you. You are my people. That is my natural reaction to the idea of solitude, but I will tell you that in studying this, I have been so surprised and so enriched and so blessed, and I've actually really needed this practice in the last couple weeks, and so I really hope that you will lean in for this series. But let's begin by looking at the life of Jesus, specifically 5 instances in the Gospels when he sought solitude. This is going to really teach us a lot about how he understood it. And the first one that I want to look at is at the beginning of his ministry, just before he kicks off his earthly ministry. We have this story of him seeking solitude. This is the story that Erica just read. It's a well-known story of Jesus going into the wilderness and fasting for 40 days. But I want to just reread the opening verse of that story. It's Matthew 4, verse 1. It says, "Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil." What I want to highlight here is that the word wilderness it's not simply just going outside. It doesn't even necessarily mean desert. The word in Greek there is eremos, which literally means solitary, lonely, or desolate place. And so he's just going kind of to a solitary place in order to fast for 40 days. And the other thing that I want to point out to you, and we're going to see this again and again, is that he didn't have to go anywhere to fast. He could have stayed home. He could have fasted in his room. He could have fasted in private. And so it's significant that he actually goes out. He goes away. He withdraws in order to fast. And we're going to see that this is a pattern in the life of Jesus. Over and over again, we see him engage in these spiritual practices like prayer, like fasting, that he could have done at home, but he chooses to withdraw. And so we're going to get to why that is in a moment, but let's keep going looking at these examples. The second is before he chooses his 12 disciples. In Luke 6, it tells us, during those days, he went out to the mountain to pray and spent all night in prayer to God. So again, notice he went away to pray. Prayer is another spiritual discipline that he could do anywhere. He does not have to leave in order to practice it, and yet he withdrew. Then the third instance, up until now, we've looked at instances of him seeking solitude before some big event, but we also see him often seeking solitude after some big event, specifically after miracles. And that's what we see in Matthew 14, after this famous miracle of feeding 5,000 people by multiplying loaves and fishes. Matthew 14:23 tells us that after this event, after dismissing the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Well into the night, he was there alone. So I'm going to start to sound like a broken record, but again, Jesus doesn't simply go home to pray, but he withdraws. The fourth example is very similar after another miracle of healing a leper. Luke 5, verses 15 through 16 tell us, "But the news about him spread even more, and large crowds would come together to hear him and to be healed of their sickness. Yet he often withdrew to deserted places and prayed." Here we get a similar sense to the story of Abraham Lincoln, this is kind of cluing us into why he is withdrawing, that much like Abraham Lincoln, he is distancing himself from the noise and the work and the crowd in order to hear from God. And then the fifth and final instance I want to bring to your attention is at the end of his life. In Matthew 26, Jesus is about to be arrested and crucified, but just before his arrest, he is in the Garden of Gethsemane. And Matthew 26:36 tells us, then Jesus came with them, the disciples, to a place called Gethsemane, and he told the disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. This example is significant because this is the only one where he's not going out into the wilderness. He's not going up on a mountain. Jesus is simply putting space between himself and the disciples. Now, this gives us a snapshot of how Jesus practiced solitude. What then does it teach us about it? How we might understand, how we might practice solitude in our own lives? Well, the first is going to sound probably surprising to many of you for whom you've been a Christian your entire lives and solitude has not been a huge part of it. But solitude is foundational to the spiritual life. That's one of the things that we derive from looking at Jesus' practice of solitude, is that solitude is actually foundational to the spiritual life. Because again, Jesus doesn't simply pray where he is. He doesn't simply fast where he is. He withdraws in order to do those things. And the reason why is that solitude is one of two essential forums for connecting with God. I'm going to tell you about the second one in a moment, but first, to understand that what we're talking about when we're talking about solitude is creating an environment, and it really can be anywhere, but creating an environment in which we reduce as much noise, reduce as many inputs as possible, so that we can be present to our own thoughts, and more importantly, to the thoughts of God. And so that's why solitude is so essential. It's this essential forum for connecting with God. But that said, for any of you here whose default is withdrawal, like this sounds very, very easy to you because you are the type of person that when things are hard, you actually disappear. If that is you, I want to be clear that the other forum for connecting with God is community. So solitude and community. I really loved the way John Mark Comer put this. He says, solitude and community are the two basic containers for the spiritual disciplines. They are the twin pillars, the two legs by which we travel the way of Jesus, all of which leads us to the second principle that derives from Jesus' practice of solitude, which is that solitude is not the same as isolation. Isolation is about disconnecting from others. And that's why it's so important that we don't conflate them. We don't treat them as synonyms. Because if what we were talking about was disconnecting from others, then that would put this in an implicit tension with community. They would constantly be fighting with one another. That is not what we are talking about. Isolation is about disconnecting from others, but solitude is about connecting with God. Jesus is not withdrawing from community. And one of the reasons we know this is going back to those examples I shared in Matthew 26 when Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane and he says, I'm going to go over there. What he says immediately after that I didn't read is that even though he separates himself from the disciples, he actually invites two of the disciples to go with him. So he's practicing solitude, but he's not by himself. He's not talking to them. They're probably sitting near him, praying for him, interceding for him, not necessarily talking with him. But all that to say, what that particular instance reminds us is that we don't have to go out into the wilderness or even be alone in order to practice solitude, because at its core, solitude is simply intentional time in quiet with God and with ourselves, which we can do anywhere. Now, this distinction between solitude and isolation, it matters particularly in our cultural context for two reasons. The first is that we live in a culture that encourages isolation, not solitude. And this is because of our smartphones. Our smartphones are presenting a constant barrier between us and human connection. How many times are you really should be present to your kids, but you're on your phone? Or maybe you should be present to your friend or to your roommate, but you're on your phone. Maybe you're on a date night and you are still on your phone. But then in addition to all of that, many of us, because of just how ubiquitous the internet is, how tied in we are to our screens, we end up staying home many nights watching Netflix or playing video games by ourselves instead of going out, because it's so much easier staying home than leaving our house and connecting with people in person. I mean, how many of us are thrilled when your plans with people get canceled last minute? It's like the greatest news that you have had all day, because it's so much easier to stay at home and just numb out on the internet. And so our culture encourages this type of isolation, this lack of human connection. But the second reason that this distinction between solitude and isolation matters is that in addition to encouraging isolation, our smartphones also discourage solitude. Because if what solitude is simply the act of being alone with your own thoughts and with God, our smartphones are constantly undermining this. We are never truly alone. We are constantly available. We are constantly being connected. We are constantly being communicated with. And so our smartphones end up distracting us from really any margin for interior examination. And so all that to say, if you are someone who is feeling dread about this practice because you already struggle with loneliness, I want to be clear that solitude is, in many ways, the solution to loneliness, not the source of it. Why? Because the practice of solitude is not about withdrawing from community. It is about removing the distractions that keep us from tending to our own souls. Solitude teaches us to be at home with ourselves and with God, which is something altogether different from social isolation. So that's the second thing that we learn from Jesus' practice of solitude. And then finally, when we look at his life, we see solitude is not inaction. I really tried to hint strongly at this in that chart where it said before or after. You could see solitude was either before or after all these major events. It should be obvious that Jesus' practice of solitude was not an escape from engaging in the world. Instead, it was how he both prepared for and processed afterward the life of faith. He sought solitude in order to prepare himself for these moments of courageous obedience. And sometimes he sought solitude in order to rest and recharge in the presence of God afterward. But the solitude was never about avoidance or escape. Now, there's so much more that I want to say this morning, and thankfully we have 3 more weeks to dive into this. But for our purposes this morning, as we wrap up, I actually want to close with one last story that drives home why this practice matters so much. This is actually, for those of you who watched the session with John Mark Comer this week, this is a story that he tells, but I wanted to mention it here just so that everyone hears it because I think it matters so much. He tells a story about the beginning stages of Martin Luther King's leadership. And in 1955, he had moved down to Montgomery, Alabama, in response to the Montgomery bus boycott. And it was during this year that he was actually nominated to lead the Montgomery Improvement Association. And what is surprising about this move, this kind of step up in his leadership, is he was not prepared for it. It really caught him off guard. It wasn't something he was necessarily seeking after. And that detail matters because as the boycott dragged on, as he faced mounting pressure, as he faced increased threats on his life, on the safety of his family, he was thrown in jail, his confidence began to waver. And he reached this moment in 1956 where he'd spent a stint in jail, and he came home and had this moment where he realized, I really need to decide if I'm willing to count the cost, if I'm really willing to keep moving forward in this. And so one night on January 1956, his wife had gone to bed and his daughter had gone to bed, and he went and he sat in his kitchen in the middle of the night, just in silence over a cup of coffee, where he reflected and he prayed. And I love that detail of this story because we've seen, Abraham Lincoln going off to his cottage or Jesus going out into the wilderness, but we're reminded by this story that you can also just seek solitude in your kitchen at night. But it was during this time spent in solitude that Martin Luther King had an experience that he later described this way. He says, "It seemed at that moment that I could hear an inner voice saying to me, 'Martin Luther, stand up for righteousness. Stand up for justice. Stand up for truth.'" Martin Luther King's biographer would later describe this event alone in his kitchen as the most important night of King's life. Now, after John Mark Comer shared this story, he asked a really poignant question, which is, what if Martin Luther King had a smartphone? What if he had not had that mental bandwidth, that mental space to unplug, to quiet the noise, to really be alone with his thoughts, with God? What would have been lost to history? What would have been lost had Abraham Lincoln had a smartphone? Because you think about what we demand of our leaders now. We constantly demand that they be offering these immediate public reactions. And if you don't offer that, people are wondering, clamoring, why aren't you speaking out? But the stories of these three men, Abraham Lincoln, Jesus, Martin Luther King, they remind us that the way to affect change is not through constant public engagement or even immediate reactions, but through intentional time alone. These three men, these three leaders who changed the course of history, this was an essential part of their influence. It created the space they needed to search themselves and to hear from God. And so as we close this morning, I actually want to specifically address the young people in the room who are growing up without ever knowing a world without this level of constant connectivity. To you, I want to say, a lot hangs in the balance of you having boundaries with your screens. A lot hangs in the balance of you having boundaries with your phone, boundaries with the internet, not simply because of the mental health effects. There's so much data about the negative mental health effects of always being connected. But stories like these also remind us that making margin to quiet the noise is about so much more than you. Because when we look back on these stories, when we look back on history, we see the greatest justice movements in the world, not the least of which is the Christian movement itself, sprung from deep wells of men and women with rich interior worlds. And you are not being raised in a culture that is teaching you how to cultivate that. That is why we are spending 4 weeks on the practice of solitude. Now, in the weeks ahead, we're going to give you guys a lot of time to process what this practice can look like in your lives. Depending on your stage of life, it is going to look different. But for this morning, what I want to do is actually spend some time practicing here in this space, because you don't have to be alone in order to practice solitude, I want you to spend some time practicing, because you're going to need to practice this week. As we head into this very consequential week where a lot of us are feeling a lot of anxiety, I want to remind you that regardless of what happens on Tuesday, there is still work to be done. But we cannot be the kind of people who can do that work. We cannot be the kind of people who point to and who live like Jesus if we are not spending time with Jesus. And so I want to challenge you to prioritize time alone with God this week. When you feel that anxiety bubbling up inside of your chest, this is a time where you need to quiet the noise. You need to get off the internet, and you need to be present to your own thoughts, but more importantly, to the voice of God. And so if you are in this room right now and you are feeling anxious and you feel that knot in your chest, I want to direct you to our prayer team. They would love to pray over you this morning. But for the rest of us, let's take some time to just center ourselves, to quiet our souls, to put your phone down, to be alone with your thoughts and with God. Not because the holiest life is the monastic life, but because solitude with God is the wellspring of holy action in the world. Let's take some time now.